The Soybean School on Realagriculture.com is brought to you by Pride Seeds, Cruiser Max Vibrants, High Stick NT, and the Manitoba Pulse Growers.
Real Agriculture comes to you today from the Southwest Ag Conference, and I'm joined by Bernard Tenuta, OMAFRA plant pathologist. Sir, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Hope you enjoyed the conference.
Oh, it's been great. Lots of people to talk to and lots of things to talk about, including white mold. And
for sure.
A big year in white mold last year, a lot of it out there. I want to talk a little bit about why 2014 was such a white mold year.
Oh yeah, no, white mold this year was the big one in terms of soybeans, and on the corn side, northern corn leaf blight is one of the big topics there. But white mold, 2014 was a perfect year for white mold development in Ontario and other areas as well around the Great Lakes as well. So a few things. Every year, it's 2014 versus 2013. Much different in terms of our potential for white mold. Every year has some degree of potential for white mold development, where those petals or those flowers, the inoculum or the ascospores are produced and they land on those petals and we get the initial infection in that. The big difference in 2014 than many of the other years in past is the subsequent environmental conditions going into the main growing part of the season. And so it stayed cooler, wetter in many cases. The cooler temperatures allowed more humidity, less evapotranspiration, and all of those things that dry out that canopy didn't really occur this year. So we had ideal situations or environmental conditions for in many fields for white mold and other foliar diseases. And that just perpetuated the disease in some fields. And so growers, if you had white mold in 2014, you've got the field history. There is potential risk for next year as well in those fields.
So let's talk about next year. We're looking at probably, there's talk of 3.2 million acres, soybeans. A lot of that's going to be soybeans on soybeans, and a lot of increasing risk. Let's talk about some of those management considerations, and obviously maybe starting with field history.
Oh, for sure. So growers that are considering soybeans on soybeans, whenever you're following a crop onto a crop, there's always disease risks and other management issues that can be occurring there that could be negative. But if you're thinking of planting soybeans on soybeans, field history for sure. Those fields that have a history of any disease or any stress, is important to note those things. So if you're going to a field that's had white mold last year, you're going to follow those up with beans. The first thing to consider is varieties and variety selections. When it comes to white mold, though, we don't have anything that we would call totally tolerant or resistant to white mold development. Even a tolerant variety will still get white mold disease, as we saw this year. Varieties that performed very well in previous years, this year still saw quite a bit of mold under those high favorable environmental conditions. So the tolerance they have was just not enough to surpass the favorable conditions for that disease to develop. So select a variety that has a good white mold rating on it. Good standability important. The architecture of that plant, how that plant grows, is really and critically important in that a more upright, tighter plant will allow for more air movement through that canopy and make it less favorable for sclerotinia, white mold development in those. Plant populations, lowering your plant populations to 120,000 or so, and that will help us to reduce our sclerotinia risk, as well as wider rows to increase that canopy and air movement in there. So a lot of the things we have been doing in narrowing our rows, increasing our plant populations, and all of those things have resulted in high yield management practices could increase our risk for diseases, and white mold's one of them.
A couple of things. A lot of guys out there talking about tillage, whether they should get in and do some tillage here. You talked about whether that's a good or a bad idea.
Yeah, when it comes to tillage and white mold, it's a catch-22 in many cases. By leaving those sclerotia on the soil surface, those little black sclerotia that form, By leaving them on the soil surface, the viability of them decreases. And so in many cases, some of the Ontario data as well as others would show, a 1.5 to 2 year rotation out of soybeans will reduce your white mold risk if those sclerotia are on the upper surface. But if you're going to plant beans on beans in 2015, for instance, and you've had white mold problems last year and you have a lot of those sclerotia on that soil surface, your risk can actually be higher in a no-till situation next year, because although the viability may decrease over time of those sclerotia, the fact you're following up beans on beans will increase the risk, because a lot of those sclerotia will germinate to form the apothecia, and those spores will be there. Your inoculum load could be higher than normal in 2015.
Final thing, let's talk a little bit about fungicides and, suppression versus control and timing.
Wow, when it comes to fungicides and white mold, we don't have any that are even registered as control products. They're also suppression only. There's a couple of products that we have that are on the biological side. One of them it has to be applied in the fall, which we've sort of missed this year with the late fall and the conditions. Has to be applied prior to planting, a month to 6 weeks prior to planting as well, just to get the biological agent onto the sclerotia and parasitize those sclerotia. Another foliar one that we have there, those two can work on the organic side of things and those production systems. And then we got a number of new products that are coming out, and we're getting more and more of them as well. And so when it comes to white mold, there's some challenges, because we're talking about those blossoms and petals as being the driver for infection. That's where it starts, and that's where the disease continues to progress and move. So you got to get good coverage, penetration, all these things that the soybean canopy makes it hard for that spray to get in there. And then we have the soybeans flower over an extended period of time, so again that window opens. As we saw this year, we have disease can start off early, and it can recycle or develop any time when the favorable environmental conditions come any time in the season. And this year was a good one where you went basically from flowering all the way through where we could see white mold development in that. So timing is critical. Unlike some of the other fungicides, you may be thinking of soybeans where you're targeting more, the upper pods as they start, those R3 stage of development. With white mold, the research is indicating that an application early on, even before you get full flower, that R2 stage, that R1, R2, can help in terms of slowing down the initial disease infection on those flowers, and then a subsequent application in years like this year where the conditions look like they're going to be favorable for an extended period. So if it's going to be a cool, wet season again, a follow-up application later on at that R3 when the pods start to form on the top of the plant or on the plant themselves, that may be another one. So that's more consistent, where 2 applications showed a response this year as opposed to 1 application, say at that later stage, that R3. But it's important. Even fungicides, you may see a decrease in disease levels, but even under really good white mold conditions, you're still going to see some disease, and we can still see some yield impact. And that's where white mold is one of those diseases that growers love to have if they have a little bit of it, because that means you've got good growing conditions, you've got high yield environment, and that. But as we saw this year, when you start going, 10, 15, 20% of the plants showing mold earlier in the season, that can have a significant impact on yield.
Well, we'll wait and see what happens. Great tips. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. And remember, every year is different. So 2014 doesn't necessarily mean that 2015 will be the same. Every year, every field is different.